You guys can go ahead and have a seat, get yourself comfortable, Good morning, New Life. My name is KJ, and I currently serve on staff at Village Church in the Midlothian, and we're basically Chesterfield County, Midlothian and Chester. We have two campuses located there, and I've been serving there for the past 5 years in various capacities, helping to shepherd God's people and to care for them. But actually, in the next few weeks, my family's moving to actually the Shenandoah Valley to Waynesboro to be a part of planting another gospel-centered church in Waynesboro. So Josh Turner asked me to come and to share with you guys a little bit of kind of the vision and mission of the church we're hoping to plant, but as well just to open up God's word to be together this morning. So I'm grateful for you guys. You welcomed me from the beginning as I walked through the doors, and so I'm grateful for that. So just thank you, and I'm grateful to be able to partner with another gospel-centered, God-honoring, loving church. And so just thank you for having me this morning. My wife would be here, but she wasn't able to this morning as she had responsibilities at our local church there. She oversees the kids ministry at the church, so she wasn't able to be here. But she would send her greetings as well. So thank you for having me. If you have your Bibles this morning, turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 through 23. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 through 23. The title for this morning's message is For the Sake of the Gospel. I don't know about any of you in here, but I'm a superhero fan, and as I like to watch superhero movies, there's always a common phrase that's said throughout the movie at some point. The phrase is that the group of heroes come together and they say, man, this is for the sake of the city, or maybe they'll say it's for the sake of the world. If you are a student, maybe you play on a sports team, or maybe you're a father or mother, you coach a sports team, and you're a part of that team. And what you say to that team in those moments, you say, hey, guys, we need to make this decision for the sake of the team. Maybe you're a businessman or woman, you have a company that you're a part of, and you talk to your employees, and you're rallying them together. Or maybe you are the employee. You're there in this moment, you're having a conversation, and the boss says it's for the sake of the company. Paul uses familiar language to us here because we've heard this phrase, for the sake of, but sometimes we don't think about it in light of the gospel. So what Paul is doing here for us in this text is using this phrase. He says, look, all things need to be moving in our lives for the sake of the gospel. Let me tease that out for us real quick here, is that for the sake of the gospel is this identity that the believers, followers of Jesus need to have, that we're being shaped in such a way that everything that's in our lives is moving towards the advancement of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So what's happening is that we're leveraging ourselves, we're expending ourselves in such a way that the gospel is going forward. That's what we're going to see here in this text this morning as we open up this passage. So if you would turn with me to this text, we're going to pick up in verse 19. This is what the word of the Lord says. It says this. It says, for though I am free from all, I've made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews, I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside of the law, I became as one outside of the law, not being outside of the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside of the law. To the weak, I became weak, and my page isn't turning. Became weak that I might win the weak, and I become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings. Let me pray first as we dive into this text this morning. Father, help us. Father, help us to see your word is true. Help us to trust it. Father, even if it rubs against our lives currently. Father, if you would do something in us here, allow through your Spirit to stir us, Father, to have a mindset that is driven by the mission of Jesus. Father, I pray that our hearts would echo the words of Paul here, that we're willing to do all things for the sake of the gospel, that they may share in his blessing. So help us in that this morning, Lord. Father, be merciful to me, a sinner, as I stand here and preach your word. Father, I pray that I will be able to stand behind the cross and boast much in the cross. So, Father, help us in this. In your name we pray. Amen. Point number one this morning, picking up in verse 19, is this: for the sake of the gospel, you need to bind yourself to the mission of Jesus. For the sake of the gospel, you need to bind yourself to the mission of Jesus. Picking up earlier on in chapter 9, Paul takes the time to explain his reasoning for not taking financial assistance from this local church. See, the church of Corinth wanted to be able to give to Paul, wanted to be able to support him financially in such a way that he didn't have to labor and toil in a what we quote unquote now call a secular job. So Paul here is in this moment, and if you know anything about Paul, he was a tent maker by trade. And so he said, hey, for the sake of the gospel going forward, I don't want to take finances from the church so that there would be no obstacles for the gospel. This is what Paul here is saying. He's saying, look, I know y'all want to give to me, but I don't want this to be a temptation for you guys to be able to hoard over me different responsibilities that you want out of me and allow that to deter the mission of Jesus from going forward. See, Paul notes here that he could have taken advantage of the opportunity to receive financial support, but he did not want an obstacle to be there in front of him. See, Paul's commitment to Christ was the driving force of his life. It was the mission of Jesus that had encompassed his heart and that had been pushing him forward. So, yes, Paul doesn't use the phrase for the sake of the gospel in verse 19 this morning, but it's ebony flowing out of his words, even in verse 19. In verse 19, I'm going to highlight this for us. It says, for though I am free from all, I've made myself a servant to all. What is Paul saying here in this text? What's happening is this, is that within the limits of his Christian liberty, he had the ability to enjoy his freedom in Christ. Paul could have. He said, I'm free from all. There's nobody that's binding me now. So he can enjoy his freedom. So for Paul, this is what this meant. That religiously and culturally, he was not bound to the cultural norms of the Jewish people because he was Jewish in his lineage. So for Paul, he's saying, look, I'm free from those cultures and those elements, and now I can live for Jesus despite any hindrances. But this is the thing about this text, is that Paul willfully gave up his rights because he was bound to a higher mission than his own. Friends, are you bound this morning to a higher mission than your own? See, this is what Paul wants us to see in this text, because Paul was free from religious practices, but he was still willing to serve all. So this is the thing, that sometimes once we're free from some things, we don't want to enter back into those environments to help point people towards the gospel. See, and that's what Paul was willing to do in this text. Even though he was liberated from the laws of the Jewish culture, he said, look, no. I want to serve them for the purpose of them knowing Jesus and enjoying him more. See, here when Paul uses the phrase servant in this text, he's trying to communicate something very particular to us. I think in the English translation, it doesn't give a good enough connotation to what this term actually means. When Paul's saying he's willing to be a servant to all, it can actually connotate this idea of enslavement to all. That he was willing to bind himself to all people for the purpose of them knowing Jesus. See, that's why Paul is willing to give himself in such a way for others. Even though they weren't followers of Jesus, I'm willing to bind myself to them, go into the spaces that they're in, so that they might too find delight in Jesus. See, when someone is bound to the mission of Jesus, they will be willing to do whatever it takes in order for someone to know Jesus. And that's the mindset that Paul had earlier on in this text, and this is what he's communicating to us. See, Paul was willing to give up much for this mission. He was known for his stature and notoriety. He was well off, but he was willing to give up all of those things in order to be a part of the mission of Jesus. See, for Paul, he understood what was happening. You see, Paul understood that the cross actually has the power to save. So I think sometimes we forget that sometimes. We think about the cross having the power to save us, but we don't think about the cross as having the power to save other people. And so for Paul in this moment, he says, look, I'm willing to connect myself so heavily to the mission of Jesus that I'm actually going to believe this. I'm going to take a step of faith. I'm going to trust this so I can reach my neighbors and care for them well for Jesus' glory. Romans chapter 1, verse 16 says this. It says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. To the Jew first and also to the Greek. See, Paul understood this reality. What has the power of God for salvation? It's the cross of Christ. It's only the cross of Christ that can save people. And so he's saying, look, why am I not giving myself to Jesus' mission in this type of way? Why am I not willing to serve the people around me in such a way that they can come to know the glory of the cross? For some of you in here this morning, you're hearing this and you're thinking, oh, well, that's the Apostle Paul. He was a great evangelist. He was a great church planter. He was pushing great gospel movements forward. You might be thinking, I just don't have the same type of flexibility that the Apostle Paul had. He was willing to give himself in such a way. That's why earlier on I made the comment of this, is that Paul worked an 8-to-5 job. Paul was willing to leverage that job for the purpose of others knowing Jesus. But it's interesting, though, for us, because sometimes we look at Paul and we say, man, he was willing to do much, but, oh, the Lord can't use somebody like me. Friends, guess what? The Lord can use somebody like you, and he wants to use somebody like you if you are willing to bind yourself to the mission of Jesus. Amen. And so this is what Paul is trying to drive home for us this morning. But this is the thing that we have to be honest and to evaluate our own hearts. Think about, if we actually love Jesus and want to serve him, are we willing to expend ourselves in a few different areas for the purpose of Jesus' glory? So this is interesting for us because sometimes it's easy for us to always find a new hobby. We always find the space and the time for that. Maybe you're like me, you like watching Netflix sometimes, so you find a Netflix series that you like to watch, and the next thing you know, you've given hours and hours to it, but we always find a way to finish and make it through season 10. You know, so this is the thing that Paul is trying to say for us here. Look, you still had time to catch up with your friends this week, right? You had enough time for girl time or for your guy time, hang out with the guys. You found time for that, but have you found enough time for the mission of Jesus? Are you willing to bind yourself to the mission of Jesus in this way, that you're willing to enslave yourself to Christ into his mission? Friends, that's what we have to come to terms with this morning. We have to reckon with our own hearts. Are we willing to even give up our own liberties for the sake of others knowing Jesus? Paul had so many different things that he could have boasted in, he could have enjoyed, and could not have been a part of because of his relationship with the Jewish people and his freedom that he had from their culture. But he is willing to give it up. You have every right to go home after work and to go home and sit on your couch, put your feet up and watch TV. You have every right to do that. But are you willing to give that up for the purpose of inviting a neighbor into your home and caring for them and pointing them to Jesus? Are you willing to give up the liberty of, yes, you do have the opportunity to go to the lake house this weekend, but guess what? You have an opportunity with your neighbors to invite them over and to have a cookout or a block party in your neighborhood. Are you willing to give up those things for the purpose of others knowing Jesus? This is what Paul's trying to get at for us here when he says, I'm willing to give up some of my liberties for the purpose of others knowing Jesus. See, as followers of Jesus, there's much that we can learn from Paul and his ambitions. Why? Because the primary moving force in his life was the gospel of Jesus Christ. See, he was willing to give up anything and everything for the sake of others knowing Jesus. And this is the point. You do not have to be a missionary overseas or a church planner to do that. We're all called to be missionaries, people living on mission in our communities for the sake of the gospel. See, friends, I don't know if you knew this or not, but each of us have a role in the mission of Jesus. You have a good role. It's a role as a disciple, but as a disciple maker. So if you're trying to figure out what your purpose is in the mission of Jesus, I can tell you that it's for you to make disciples and you to buy in to the mission of Jesus holistically in this type of way. So for my wife and I, as we've been considering the mission of Jesus in our lives, we've been serving in our context for a while, and we've been excited about the disciples that have been made. We felt the tug in our hearts to actually relocate. It was actually through a series of conversations with people in Waynesboro where we're talking to them, and we felt the heartbeat and the pull to be a part of another gospel movement in the city. And so that's what God did in us. But this is the thing, though, friends. God's doing something in you. This is the thing. Where God has placed you at, he's called you on mission at. So just for us in our story is that God was calling us to go somewhere else for the sake of the gospel. But friends, this is my thing. Are you going to bind your life to the mission of Jesus and New Hope in such a way that your neighbors can experience the glory of the cross? And that's where our posture needs to be at this morning. See, our aim and our labor, our toil is for the purpose of others knowing Jesus. Are we willing to expend ourselves? Are you willing to bind yourself to Jesus' mission? Why? Because when you do that, disciples will be made. People will come to faith in Jesus. It might be a long, laborious process at times, but Jesus will save people. Why? Because the gospel actually has the power to save. Point number 2 this morning. For the sake of the gospel, make more disciples of Jesus. For the sake of the gospel, make more disciples of Jesus. Picking up in verse 20, I want to reread this for us this morning. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside of the law I became as one outside of the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside of the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. What is Paul really trying to say here for us? I think what Paul's trying to communicate to us is that disciple making is essential to the Christian life. See, he doesn't use the terms disciple making there, but he says, I'm willing to give up of myself both to the Jews and the Gentiles for the purpose of them knowing Jesus. That's what disciple making is. See, Paul was willing to make himself a servant to all for the purpose of them to be able to grow in their love and adoration for Jesus. So it's in his freedom that he did not observe the principles of the culture, but in his liberty, he chose to serve them so that they could be won to Christ. See, friends, disciple making has to be at the forefront of your mind. For you to be willing to give up of your God-given rights and privileges for the sake of others knowing Jesus. It has to be at the forefront of your mind. It's not something that you just grow into. As you become a disciple, you're called to go out and to continue to make disciples. And for Paul, he looked at his neighbors. He said, look, I have Jewish neighbors here and I have Gentile neighbors here. I want to do whatever it takes to get into those spaces so that they can know Jesus. I don't care if they're different than me. I don't care if they're similar to me. I don't care if we have the same background or story. But guess what? Jesus wants to save them. And I'm willing to go wherever that's going to call me. See, if your neighbors have cultural distinctives, it's okay for you to observe them in order to gain a hearing for the gospel. That's what Paul's saying here. As long as it's not going against the gospel of Jesus, the truth of the gospel of the scriptures, you can observe these things and walk into spaces with them to leverage it for the sake of the mission of Jesus. So for Paul, this was abiding different ceremonial regulations, observing special holidays, and not eating particular foods in his culture. Because he went to Jewish homes and he said, look, you might be observing these things, but I'm willing to go into these spaces and do whatever it takes. So I'll give up of some rights that I have. Let me give an example for us this morning. So if you have a neighbor that happens to be Muslim and you invite them over for dinner, I probably recommend that you don't have bacon on the menu. If you want a quick, easy offense for the gospel, that's probably a quick one, okay? My point is this, is that it's okay for us to not try to offend somebody for no intentional, no good reason, actually. Why do that? We want to gain hearing for the gospel. Why? Because the gospel is offensive enough. So even though people are placing themselves under various laws, this is what we can do. We can contextualize the gospel to them without going against our moral convictions. So this is what Paul's doing in this text. I think he's putting on contextual theology on display for us. He's saying, look, you can take the gospel to any cultural context. You can make much of Jesus and point others to the cross. This is the thing, though. You can't abuse your freedom here because it's going to be easy for you to want to abuse your freedom. Galatians chapter 5, verse 13 says this. It says, for you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. So how you use your Christian liberty really matters. See, Christians can abuse their freedom that they have and use it for bad intentions. For some of you, this might be a temptation for you. You say, oh, I have my friend that I've known for a while that lives in the community. You know, they're having some guys over to the house and they're going to spend some time together. You know what that means. And so they're going to spend some time. I'm going to go over there and hang out with them and I'm going to try to reach them with the gospel. Next thing you know, you're 5 deep and you're oh, well, I intended to go there for a purpose. I was trying to contextualize the gospel to them. I was trying to reach them. See, that's where we can abuse the Christian liberties for the purpose of bad intentions sometimes, right? That comes out of that, flows out of it. Sometimes in your mind you're thinking good intentions, but it flows out in a bad way. This is the point here. Within the claims of the gospel, Paul is calling us to go to places, go to spaces, to leverage our lives. The gospel frees us from a lot of things, but we're supposed to be intentional in these spaces. We need to be thinking about how this impacts people, but as well, we need to be guarding ourselves from falling into temptations. But this is the thing, though. The gospel gives us the liberty to walk into these spaces. So we need to go there. We need to be willing to expend ourselves, leverage our lives, leverage our freedoms for the sake of other people knowing Jesus. See, God wants you to use your freedom to make more disciples of Jesus. See, it's not for the purpose of you boasting in your own flesh. It's not for the purpose of you saying, well, I have this liberty. I can do anything that I want. It's for the purpose of others knowing Jesus. So you can explain to them the freedom that they can have in Jesus. See, Paul here, when towards the end of this passage that we read, he says this. He says, I've become all things to all people that by all means I might save some. Is that your mentality? Is that the way you're thinking? Like, I'm trying to be all things to all people so I can win some. Just a few. I might not win hundreds, but if we can just win a few with the ministry of our home, if we could just win a few while we're at the workplace, if we could just win a few as I'm going through the grocery store market, if I could just win a few, Lord, if you're willing to at the gas station when I'm having a conversation, are we willing to become all things to all people that some might be saved? See, here's the good news here, because Paul did not compromise the gospel to do any of this. He did not have to deny truth, but he also didn't do anything to intentionally offend them either. So I think for some of us this morning, our hurdle is in actually making disciples is that we're not willing to go to spaces. Either because you think you will capitulate to the environment, or you think that you're just not ready yet. This is the thing, you're ready. Do you have faith in Jesus? Has the gospel saved you? Then you have some good news to share to the people around you. But this is the thing. Don't offend them for no reason. Don't be that weird Christian person that's just trying to offend them because you're trying to be more holy. Guess what? The gospel is offensive enough. That's the point. When we share the good news of the cross, that is going to offend within itself. And so we want to create a welcoming space so that people can hear the good news of the gospel. So my question for you this morning is, are you willing to become all things to all people so that they can know Jesus? Are you willing to do this? See, we often hear people say that they're willing to make disciples. We hear that often. But we don't hear many people saying, I'm willing to become all things to all people. I'm willing to go to the people where they're at, in the midst of their sin, their brokenness, and reach them with the good news of the gospel. In our local church, if you guys are like us, I've heard people say all the time, well, I want to make disciples, I just don't know where to start. I just don't know where. I just wish somebody would come that I could disciple. And friends, I just want to warn you about a few things with that mentality, because guess what? There's people that come through your doors all the time that need to become disciples of Jesus. There's people that you probably even walk through these doors this morning that are not followers of Jesus, that want to become followers of Jesus, that want to be discipled. See, friends, when Jesus says the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few, he's not joking there. Because this is the thing, we're called to be bound to the mission of Jesus. We're called to go out for the sake of the gospel and to make more disciples, but are we willing to go? So this is the thing that we tend to do, though. We tend to say that disciple making is about the type of disciple we want to make. Well, Lord, I want to make disciples, but I just haven't had the type of lady that I wanted to invest my time in. She's not like me, or he's not like me. We don't have the same hobbies or interests, and so I can't really bring them into a relationship with me. We have nothing to connect on. See, I don't think that's the heartbeat of Paul in this text. He says all things to all people. He says Jew, Gentile, I don't care who you are, but this is the good news of the gospel. It needs to go to this people. See, disciple making is not about your preferences. See, it's not about your stage in life, and it's not about your ideal disciple. But it's about God wanting to save people. So this is the thing that we have to die to ourselves in that. So when you bind yourself to the mission of Jesus, you're forced to die to yourself and commit to his mission and be willing to make disciples of whoever God places before you. Are we willing to do that? Or are we willing, or more willing to try to make more disciples that emulate us? Think about that. Do you only want disciples that look like you, talk like you, act like you, think like you? Or are you trying to make disciples that actually look like Jesus? Because when you think about it that way, that's going to push you across different boundaries, different types of relationships to make disciples. See, for some of us this morning, you spent your entire life rallying behind the mission of Jesus. But that's not what Jesus wants for your life. Some of you might be thinking, why would he ever say that? Why wouldn't he want us to be rallying behind the mission of Jesus? See, friends, this morning, Jesus wants you actually to bind yourself to his mission. There's a difference. You can show up to a rally and do nothing after the rally. You can come to and say, look, we're all about making disciples, reach people with the gospel. We can say that this morning, but we don't leave these doors and say, hey, we actually want to make disciples in our context. You're actually not binding yourself to the mission of Jesus. It's just a rallying point for you. Are you willing to bind yourself to the mission in that way? See, we need to leverage ourselves for the sake of others knowing Jesus. We need to do this in our jobs. We need to do this in our communities. We need to do this in any area that we enter into. And friends, this is a noble task. This is the task that Jesus has called us to. And quite frankly, this is the mission of the church. The mission of the church is to make disciples. This is the thing, though. As we seek to make more disciples, guess what? We're going to reach more people. We're going to plant more churches. So as we make more disciples, we're going to reach people in different areas, and then we're going to actually plant more churches. And that leads me to point number 3 this morning. For the sake of the gospel, let's plant more churches. For the sake of the gospel, let's plant more churches. Verse 23 says this. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings. As Paul went on his missionary journeys, he sought to make more disciples throughout every region. See, it was the gospel that moved him from city to city to plant more churches. Some commentators like to say that Paul planted about 10 churches along the way. But Paul would not have been willing to plant more churches if he wasn't willing to leverage himself for the sake of the gospel. Because the gospel is the only thing that would move him from city to plant more churches. If you look in the book of Acts, you can see the story of Paul and how the Spirit drove him to different places to reach people with the good news of the gospel. So friends, what does it look like this morning for the totality of your lives to be driven by the mission of Jesus? Are you willing for the mission of Jesus to push New Life Baptist Church together as a whole to reach more people in New Hope and to plant more churches eventually? Like, is that your hope? Is that your desire as a people to make more disciples of Jesus? I think that's what God is calling us to. But that will only happen if we're willing to do all things for the sake of the gospel. See, it's interesting when you hear people talk about moving to a new location. I've had a few conversations with people that have moved to the Richmond area, or maybe they're moving from our church going somewhere else. And you hear them talk about a few things. You might hear them talk about, well, I'm trying to find the right job. You might hear them say, well, I'm looking for the right school. You might say, I'm looking for a place that's in proximity to family. You hear them say, well, I'm looking for a place at fairly low crime rate. One of the last things that you hear them talk about is the mission of Jesus. One of the last things. One of the last things you hear them talk about is, like, can I find a healthy local church to make disciples alongside of? You rarely hear people talk about, well, I feel like the Lord's calling us to a space to make disciples intentionally in this community. Because this is the thing, though. We need to see the places that we live in as a missional hub. We need to see it as the place that God in his sovereignty has placed us in for the purpose of reaching more people with the good news of the gospel. And this is what Paul did. As Paul went into a new environment, he said, look, the Lord's placed us here for a reason. What does God want to do? So he was willing to expend himself in these communities. See, if Paul didn't have this mindset of living for the sake of the gospel, Paul would not have planted 10 more churches. He wouldn't have. He would have stopped with one and been like, well, we got a nice little body here. That's cool. But he said, no, we want to reach more people. See, friends, I don't know where God's going to take you at for the sake of his gospel. This is the thing, though. He wants to start where you're at right now. And he wants you to bind yourself to his mission. This is the thing, though. Are you willing to be faithful to Jesus and his mission in this way? Like, is Jesus' mission good enough for you? Do you feel like God has to give you more for you to be satisfied with his mission for your life? And this is the thing. Paul said, no, this is enough. He went from town to town doing this. And so I think we should as well be convinced of this. Looking at the second phrase in verse 23, he says that I might share with them in his blessing. As we live for Jesus, our desire should be to see as many people as possible share in the blessings that we have in Jesus. If you need a reminder of the blessings that you have in Jesus, go to Ephesians chapter 1, where we see that Paul talks about our adoption, him saving us, him justifying us through the cross. This is what Jesus accomplished on our behalf, and we should want others to experience that blessing that they can have in Jesus. This term to share in the original language has this idea of partnership. You want them to become partners with you in the gospel. You want them to become family with you in the gospel. See, that's the way that you should see your neighbors. You want them to go from not being his people to God's people and a part of the family of God, the household of faith. We should want them to share in the blessing that they can have in Jesus, being adopted into the family of God. So this is why we need to participate in all areas of our lives for the sake of the gospel of Jesus. We need to invest in our families for the sake of the gospel, that our families will know and love Jesus. We need to invest in our community for the sake of the gospel. That's why as well we need to invest in the workplace for the sake of the gospel. This is why we live on mission, for the sake of the gospel. And that's Paul's big idea for us in this text this morning. So as we live, as we breathe, that should be the purpose behind our lives. See, friends, one of the best ways for us to reach our neighbors is through disciple making and church planting. And at the local church that I'm a part of right now, currently, we've always had a heartbeat to be a part of church planting. I remember back in 2013, I first caught moves of the church planting movements that were transpiring throughout the world, and I was intrigued by those ideas. I was like, Father, do you want me to be a part of this one day? And I was like, I think you do want me to. I remember meeting some pastors that were saying we want to be a part of planting churches that plant churches. Not just starting with just planting one church, but churches that plant churches. So we had a conversation about this. And they were casting vision for their local body and their hopes to plant churches all throughout the Richmond area. And I was like, that sounds great to me. I was thinking at that time that I would either go to Richmond or DC to plant a church one day. And God had opened this door for us. And so I kind of stepped into this opportunity, and I've been working on staff at Village for about 5 years now, being a part of the church planting movements happening in Richmond. By God's grace, we've been able to plant another local body. I actually serve on staff. We're basically one church, 2 locations, and so I'm on staff at the second location, which is a plant that's about a year old right now. And God's moved in so many really cool ways through that plant. But this is the cool thing, though. Over time, the Lord started working in my wife's and I's heart, and He started drawing us away from the city of Richmond. And He's calling us to come to the Shenandoah Valley to plant another gospel-centered, autonomous local church. And so this is what the mission of Jesus does in our lives. It calls us and it moves us to places. And this is why as local churches we need to support this cause. Just for the sake of it, I know you are in this area. I just want to share with you some of the statistics of why our heartbeat was for this community. Within Stanton, Waynesboro, and Augusta County, there's 120,000 people. Statistics show that about 70% of the people do not know Jesus. I'll do the quick math for you. That's 80,000 people. So if I walk into the Walmart in my community, that's 7 out of 10 people that don't know Jesus. So when people have conversations with me about, well, why do we need another church? I'll say there's 80,000 people here that don't know Jesus. And our churches cannot hold them to capacity. Like if we filled up every church here, we busted out the seams. But this is the point. We need to plant more churches to reach more people with the good news of the gospel. We need to praise God for the gospel work through other local churches. But as well, we need to reach communities with the good news of the gospel that are not being reached. So that's why we're planting what we call New Valley Church. That's why we're planting it. See, as Paul shares his vision in this text of living for the sake of the gospel, this idea has been a driving force for our gathering team. Our vision statement is that New Valley Church exists to see people living for the sake of the gospel. That's what we want to do. We want to see people doing that. But that's undergirded by our mission statement, which is this. We exist to worship God by seeing as many people as possible transformed by the gospel. That's what's driving us. We don't want to see people just say they come to faith in Jesus and not really be a disciple, but those two come hand in hand. We want to see their lives transformed by the good news of the gospel. That's what we're aiming for. And so as we live out our vision, we want to see people living for the sake of the gospel. We want to see teachers teaching for the sake of the gospel, lawyers lawyering for the sake of the gospel. You name it. We want to see them living for the sake of the gospel in that sphere of influence. Why? Because we're called to live in every area of our lives for the sake of the gospel. I want to share with you our core values this morning. We have 4 core values. The first one is this: it's redemption. It all begins and starts with Jesus. Jesus is the Redeemer, and only He can redeem our lives. We're all looking for a good redemption story. That's why we watch a bunch of bad movies. Because we're looking for redemption stories, but guess what? There's one Redeemer. Second is this: because we've been redeemed into a mission, as we've heard this morning. The mission of Jesus needs to drive us and push us forward. The third is this: it's community. You haven't been redeemed into isolation, but you've been redeemed into a people that Jesus has ransomed for Himself. That you need to gather together and grow together in the gospel. And the fourth is this: multiplication. We're always multiplying. We need to multiply the disciples that we're making. As we multiply the disciples we're making, by God's grace, we will plant more churches. See, friends, our hope is that we will be able to be another healthy local church in the community that's seeking to reach our neighbors, contextualize the gospel well. So I ask that you would pray for us in this endeavor. Because one of the beautiful components of church planting is that we can celebrate other plants because we're reaching more people. That's why we plant churches, is to reach non-believers with the good news of the gospel. This morning, as I was talking to Josh, he wanted me to share some ways that you can potentially partner with us in this endeavor. The first is prayer. I want to encourage you to pray for us. I have some cards that if you're interested in them that you could get, you can maybe place on your refrigerator. Think about us, remember us often as we're getting this gospel work off of the ground. This is the thing, that anything that happens of eternal significance starts with us on our knees, petitioning the Father to work and move on our behalf. Because we need God to move. The second is this: you might be able to join us through supporting us in a team. Maybe there might be something that's happening that y'all might want to be a part of one day. Say, hey, we're doing this event in ways we're trying to reach our community. And y'all say, hey, we have 10 hands that are willing to serve. That could be a way that y'all could partner with us to advance the mission of Jesus. But as well, you might know people that are in that community that say, hey, we actually feel called to labor hard here. Make a connection for us. We would love to get to know them. We would love to talk to them. That they want to reach people with the good news of the gospel in that community. We want to have a good relationship with them. Maybe talk about what it looks like to partner with us in reaching people. And the last one is this, that maybe you have heard this and you're like, man, I'm really compelled. I want to see this go forward. You're saying, hey, outside of what you're giving to your local church, you're saying, look, outside of your offering, your tithes, you're saying, hey, we just want to give a little something to help this. I lived in Waynesboro. I've got neighbors, I have family there. I just want to labor in that. You can do that as well, too. You can go to newvalleychurch.com, and there's a giving tab there as well. But that's not the most important thing to me. I hope you know that. The most important thing to me is reaching people with the good news of the gospel, and just even having y'all's prayer is what really matters to me. And so I would welcome that. Pray for me, pray for the love of my wife in that season. Planting's hard. And so this is the thing, that we have a team of people that are committing themselves to this, and y'all understand that. Y'all been there. And so we're asking for prayer in this endeavor. But I don't want to leave you this morning thinking about New Valley Church. I want to leave you this morning thinking about living for the sake of the gospel in your own life. I want you to take the mission of Jesus personally in your own life. I want you to think about, what can you do to live for the sake of the gospel in your life right now? How can you be expending yourself in your neighborhood? How can you be making more disciples in your community? How is God calling you to bind yourself even more to the mission of Jesus? And guess what? You can do that today. So if that's you, maybe you've been a follower of Jesus, maybe you've become complacent. This morning, I want to encourage you to reflect on your own heart. I want to encourage you to say, Jesus, I need to give more to your mission. Even if you've been making disciples, you have more that you can give. But maybe you're somebody in here this morning that you've heard me talk about people giving themselves to Jesus in this type of way. And you're like, man, if they're willing to give themselves to Jesus in this type of way, man, what Christ did on the cross must be true. This morning, I want you to know this, is that Christ died on the cross for your behalf. So you can be redeemed by the blood of his sufficient atoning sacrifice. And this morning, I want you to know that there's hope that can be found in Jesus that can satisfy your soul. And as we're seeking to go reach more people with the good news of the gospel, guess what? Jesus wants to reach you with the good news of the gospel, because he died for you. So if that's you,